If you enjoy our podcasts, please like and subscribe and consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Albuquerque Journal to help us continue to bring you more content like this. You can find this episode and all our podcasts on the Albuquerque Journal website, abqjournal.com, as well as YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, and SoundCloud. See the show notes for a discount on a digital subscription. Thank you for supporting the Albuquerque Journal, New Mexico's leading local news source.
Hi, I'm Dan Boyd.
And I'm Megan Gleason.
And this is Rounding Up the Roundhouse, a podcast that will be coming to you at least twice a week about the legislative session in Santa Fe.
We're looking forward to sharing everything that's going on in the Roundhouse with you guys.
The start of the session is coming up rapidly and a lot going on, a lot of preparations. What are some of the things that you're watching for, Megan?
Well, I don't know what we're not looking at in the 60-day session. With the governor's last 60-day session, it's kind of a whirlwind of activity with the crime packages after a special session where not a lot got done. There's a lot of stuff around the economy, the border, especially with President-elect Donald Trump coming in with strong border security policies. What's top of mind for you, Dan?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see some of the agendas come into focus a little more. House Democrats had a news conference where they laid out some of their priorities, talking about public safety, talking about reforming CYFD, the Child Welfare Agency, also talking about maybe some tax code changes. And I know the House Republicans have also had news conference of their own, kind of talking about some of their priorities for the session.
Yeah, it was very similar. And there's a lot of sentiment this year about working across the aisle, which is interesting because we see it every year that, you know, they want to have bipartisanship, and it'll be interesting this year with all the new faces with the female majority for the first time ever to see if that actually happens, as the Republicans are in the minority.
And I think we always hear before a session talk about compromise and working together. And then once things get underway, I think we'll see, I'm sure there will be disagreements, and we'll see once they get into the details. I think another big theme we're kind of keeping an eye on is the governor, as you mentioned, her last 60-day session, and whether she's on the same page on some of these issues with legislators after the special session last year.
Yeah, it was a really interesting divide, seeing the Democratic governor more aligned with the Republicans in some of her priorities that she was pushing for, something that we really haven't seen from Lujan Grisham.
Yeah, and I even asked House Speaker Javier Martinez and some other top House Democrats last week if they'd been in touch with the governor's office on some of these bills, and they said, yeah, there'd been some dialogue, but you know, not necessarily. You know, we have a deal on all of this stuff. So I know the governor's been holding town hall meetings on crime around the state, and it seems like she's still really pushing for a lot of those issues that we saw last year that didn't have buy-in from the legislature. So do you have any sense whether things will be different this time around? Or?
I don't know. I mean, the House Republicans said that they know some of the Democrats want to introduce packages around tax reforms or crime, but they really haven't had a seat at the table. And they still said that they feel like they have to force their way in to have a seat at the table. So if we're really going to see that kind of working across the aisle, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and for me, I think one of the fascinating things will be kind of Democratic leadership in the House and Senate. And if they can work with the governor, I mean, during the first term, they were on the same page, and it was rare to see the governor's agenda not advanced. And that's changed quite a bit over the last year or two now with the governor approaching her final 2 years in office here. So to see whether they kind of push back on some of that. I've also heard that they may be trying to move bills a little bit quicker in the 60-day session as usual. Usually the first 30 days of a 60-day session can be kind of a little laid back, a lot of speeches, a lot of performances, stuff like that. But House and Senate have both said that they want to try to move bills a little bit more quickly and maybe get some of them up to the governor's desk even by the halfway point of the session. Yeah,
it feels like there's a rush this year to get things done. And I think the other interesting thing with this session, especially the start of the session, is that it's the day after President-elect Donald Trump's inauguration. So I'm curious to see how that'll affect state political tensions, because it's an incredibly tense time in the state and nationwide.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that could add a little more urgency to some of these measures, and certainly to see what happens, in President-elect Trump's first, 30 days in office, and how the legislature and the governor respond to that. I mean, we could see some bills to respond to what's happening in D.C. and maybe a little more urgency than we've seen perhaps over the last 4 years on some of these issues.
Yeah, those border security bills are going to be really interesting to watch and to see how the Democrats kind of react to that. And New Mexico is so reliant on an immigrant workforce that it ties so directly into our economy.
Right. You touched on this too. We're out of 112 legislators, 28 of them will be first-time legislators. So, what dynamic, what effect do you think that might have on the legislature?
Well, you'd hope it would have a refreshing effect, right? But I don't know. We'll see. It'll be an interesting climate for sure, to say the least.
Yeah, I've talked to some legislators who say maybe with this amount of new faces, they might be able to move some bills that they haven't been able to in past years, like reforming the capital outlay system. That's one of the ones that I'll kind of believe it when I see it, because I've heard a lot of talk about that over the years. But I think there is a thought maybe now with some new members who may be more open to changes like that than some previous legislators who are more kind of, familiar and kind of more comfortable with the old system, I guess.
Yeah, bringing in those fresh perspectives.
Yeah.
I think it'll be interesting, too, on bills where we already know there probably won't be movement, like the Paid Family and Medical Leave Act that has been trying to get through the roundhouse for years and has drawn up controversy, and Democrats aren't agreeing on different versions and introducing different versions, and the House Republican leadership has said that that's where they draw the line. They haven't seen a version yet that they would support. So there are still bills where, even though it's new faces,
Right.
no momentum.
Yeah, and even though Democrats, after the election, they lost one seat in both the House and the Senate, but still have a pretty healthy majority in both chambers. So I think, seeing what some of those moderate Democrats, as we saw last year, the paid family leave bill died on the House floor by 2 votes. And that was because, moderate Democrats voting against the bill along with Republicans. So I think some of those people will have a lot of influence again in, determining whether some of these bills get through or not. Yeah.
And it's always interesting to kind of speculate about what's going on behind closed doors, because not all of those conversations are happening on the floor. Right. Yeah. I've always wanted to be a fly in the wall in those caucus meetings and hear those discussions. You've been looking into, I know, some climate bills, some water bills, things like that. I mean, that seems like another issue that could be a big one this session. Yeah, I do think it's going to be a big one. And after the last 60-day session, there was a lot of frustration from environmentalists about some of the governor's vetoes and not letting some of the environmental regulations get through the roundhouse. And New Mexico is a really unique state, right? Because we're so dependent on oil and gas. At the same time, we're trying to diversify our economy away from that and move toward renewables. So how do you do that while maintaining the state's economy is like the crux of the question. Right. And this issue of the strategic water supply, which I'm still doing my bedtime reading on, trying to get up to speed on some of that. But I mean, obviously, and with the fires we've seen these last few years in New Mexico, I mean, it seems like there's some urgency given the state's revenue situation to try and take some action on those issues. Yeah, huge. Even with the LA fires right now, I think it hits pretty close to home for New Mexicans. And one other bill that's going to be really interesting with the environment is the state land office pushing to increase royalty rates, which is something that they keep trying to do. Right. And this last session, finally, after they wouldn't pass it again in 2024, the state land office commissioner, Stephanie Garcia Richards, said, "I'm not going to lease the best tracts of oil and gas land until you raise royalty rates so that we're in line with Texas and the private market." So it'll be interesting to see if that kind of incentive is going to push legislators to get that across the finish line or not. And now with going back to what we had talked with the Trump administration too, and whatever kind of environmental regulations might get changed under a Trump presidency and how that affects New Mexico. We're now the second biggest oil producing state behind only Texas in the nation. And obviously the state budget depends largely on oil and gas, but there is a discussion, I think, at the Roundhouse about eventually what comes next and what, if anything, can kind of replace that. And right now it doesn't seem like there's anything really nearly that scope of the oil industry as far as from a budget standpoint. Yeah, nothing's one for one with the oil industry in New Mexico. And it ties directly into education as well, because that's where education gets all of its money from in the state. And that's something else House Republican leadership brought up, is that they're really disappointed with the lack of progress happening with education, despite all of the money New Mexico is pouring into education. Yeah, I think that's been a theme we've seen the last few years. I mean, amazing amounts of revenue pouring into the state, but that money alone can't address some of these issues overnight. I think when it comes to early childhood as well, and it seems like you need that infrastructure in place, right? I mean, the employees, people who are trained to do these jobs, and you can't just necessarily throw money and expect that overnight
things are going to improve that will be first in the nation.
Yeah. Programs need to be implemented. Change needs to happen. And it's interesting, all this money that we're throwing everywhere. I keep hearing this at the legislature of New Mexico is not a poor state. Stop thinking we're a poor state. We have so much money. We just have to allocate it in the right way. Right.
And I think you did a story recently now up to $58 billion in the state investment office that's overseen, which I think if we were a sovereign country, we'd be up there in the top 50, 100 countries. But then trying to find a way to, put this money to use, but also to hold on to it for the future. I mean, obviously when oil might not be around.
Mm-hmm. Do you see any priorities from a budget perspective coming up in the Roundhouse this year?
There's a lot of talk. One thing we haven't hit on is behavioral health, which I think is a big issue, and everyone acknowledges that. House Democrats talked about a new trust fund, $200 million for behavioral health, and that could be used to build new facilities around the state, kind of ramp up the workforce, efforts like that. So I think, that's been one approach the legislature's used, is setting up these trust funds with the amount of money, with the thinking that can help now, but also in the future, we can kind of have a reliable source of funding for these programs. They've done that with conservation. They've done it with early childhood. So now behavioral health might be the next one. I mean, what that really looks like and the details, I think, is something we're going to obviously be digging into more.
Yeah. And the trust funds, the legislature loves the trust funds because instead of one-time allocations, you're investing for the future as well as now.
Right.
And the early childhood fund that you brought up is kind of astonishing how much it's grown. It was just created in 2020, I think it was, and it has grown so much. So I could definitely see the legislature trying to emulate that again.
Right. And then I think the question raised, at some point when the economy goes down or oil drops, will those trust funds maybe be raided by the legislature? Maybe that's a story for another day. But you're right. I mean, I think that early childhood one is up to like $10 billion now, and it was at $300 million just 5 years ago. So
yeah, crazy jump.
One other issue I wanted to bring up, that kind of in the rare situation, we're only, a few days out from the start of the session, but there's still 2 empty seats in the House, which is rare for this close to an election. This close to a session. I've been kind of looking into those. Obviously, there's the House District 6 seat, which is what Representative Alcone had represented, and then he had to step down due to health issues and passed away, unfortunately. Now trying to fill that seat. Also another seat down in Roswell area, House District 59 with Jared Hembry, and he recently stepped down due to health issues as well. Do you think, I guess speculating, but that those will be filled before we get underway at the Roundhouse?
I think they'll definitely try to fill them. It's hard. It's so fast coming up. We have so many bills that have already been pre-filed to get somebody to jump on those seats immediately. But I think with this 60-day session being the governor's last, nobody really wants to put anything off. They want to go all in this session. So they're definitely going to want to have people in those seats representing them.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, those people are, if they are appointed, going to have to pack their suitcases fast to get ready. But I think certainly there is a desire on everyone's part to make sure all districts are represented by the time things get underway at the Roundhouse.
Yeah. And it'll be so interesting coming off this 5-hour special session. Because the House Republican leadership really voiced confidence that the Democrats and the Republicans could come together on these crime issues, on behavioral health issues. But I think I'm still wanting to see what exactly has changed since the special session, that we would see action now that we didn't over the summer.
Right. And I think the rhetoric, may have cooled off a little bit, but I haven't heard of any kind of kumbaya moment. We're all back on the same page again. The governor on social media has been telling people to call their legislator and urge them to support her crime measures. She's traveled around the state holding these town hall meetings. So I think it'll be interesting to see if the legislature feels pressure, after the special session and after the election to act on some of these, or if they're kind of more, feel kind of ennobled a little bit to say, no, this is our package and we don't necessarily want to pass your bills, especially since 2 years you're going to be out of here.
Yeah. And I think the pressure is coming from all around too. Like in Albuquerque, crime has always been an issue in Albuquerque. And I was just at an economic forum where Mayor Tim Keller spoke, and he said it's so nice to finally see the legislature prioritizing crime, something that they've been asking them to talk about again and again and again. And this feels like the first time it's actually happening.
Yeah. And I think it is going to be a major discussion. I do think, some legislators have the perspective, we've already passed a lot of these measures, and some of them are not being implemented by DAs or by police departments. And that, should we just pass more kind of feel-good legislation if it's not going to really make a difference? But I do get the sense, too, and I think some of our polling we did last year really showed that, especially in Albuquerque, but not only in Albuquerque, people are concerned about crime and, concerned about its impact on their day-to-day lives.
Yeah. And these bills are really complicated. I mean, just understanding and wrapping your head around it can be quite a challenge sometimes, which is why part of the reason, right, that Democratic leadership didn't want to pass things in the special session. They said it felt really rushed. They want to take time to understand that there isn't any unintended consequences coming off of these major pieces of legislation trying to change these generational things in the state.
And yeah, I think that's right. I think issues like criminal competency and homelessness, I mean, these are complicated issues. And New Mexico is not the only state trying to figure out solutions. It was interesting to me that the House Democrats did say, tougher penalties for human trafficking, for fentanyl trafficking. Those are things they support. And I could see those moving quickly and getting some bipartisan support. Yeah. I don't know if Republicans talked about those as well.
It was similar as well. Yeah. They definitely talked about fentanyl issues and especially with juvenile justice issues.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So those are ones that I could see maybe getting some bipartisan support. But I think when it gets into the competency stuff, some of those issues, especially that they have a lot of constitutional issues, right? I mean, can we... even with pretrial detention is an issue they've been debating for years. And is it fair to hold somebody if they've only been accused of a crime and haven't been convicted of a crime yet? But I think on the other side there's a sense of frustration that a certain small percentage of the population is committing a lot of crimes and repeating reoffenses, and so kind of juggling. I think it's always tricky when emotion is involved too, and to sort out that emotion and the facts and the data, and then to try and come up with some policy that addresses those issues.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what bills actually make it to committee or don't get blocked from getting on a committee schedule, which is really up to the Democratic leadership, right?
Right. I mean, it's up to the chair of each committee, and then obviously we'll see on the opening day of the session who those committee chairs are and whether there's some changes from the last 2 years. And there are a few committees that will need new chairs just because of either, the person didn't run for re-election or was appointed to leadership. But yeah, the committee chairs is huge. And then also along those lines, which committees those bills get assigned to. I mean, we know there's some committees that are tougher committees to get through and others that are a little bit easier. So especially I think as the session kind of starts working its way to the second half into February and March, which bills are moving and which kind of get hung up in committee. So
yeah, and remind me, Dan, doesn't the governor have a certain deadline to sign bills if they get to her desk in a certain period of time in the session?
Yeah, that's right. So if the bill arrives at the governor's desk before the last 3 days of a session, she has to act on it, either sign it or veto it. If it gets to her desk in the last 3 days, then she has until 20 days after the session, and then so she can take her time a little more, deciding whether to sign it or veto, or what's called pocket veto when she doesn't even act on it. So I do think it's crossed my mind there could be a little strategy to try to get these bills to her earlier so she has to either act on them one way or another. And I'll be really interested to see if she does veto some of these bills, if there's any appetite for maybe a veto override, which is something we haven't seen much at the Roundhouse.
Yeah, and the pocket vetoes are always something as a point of debate because she doesn't have to include a message with pocket vetoes, right? Yeah, which has caused some controversy. And yeah, I wonder if bills are going to get assigned to maybe only one committee to really speed them through the Roundhouse and just get it to the governor's desk so she has to sign them quickly.
Yeah, or either sign or veto
or
them
not.
Quickly. Yeah, and then if there is a veto, then they have a chance to respond to it. I mean, to my knowledge, I don't believe there's been a veto override of this governor since she took office in 2019. So, historically, that's been kind of poking your finger in the eye of a governor, to override one of their bills. But based on the way the special session went last year and the aftermath of that, I could see that happening. There's, one area in particular, CYFD. This governor has made it clear she didn't want kind of structural changes or outside oversight, and the legislature is talking pretty strong this year about that's something they're going to pursue. Yeah,
it kind of feels like there's nothing to lose this year. Like just go all in.
Yeah, and I think you brought this up, but for the governor, this is her last 60 day. After this, she'll have still one more 30-day session next year. But historically, those final 30-day sessions have, kind of a lame duck session. So I think really this is her chance to really kind of, add a little more to her legacy and how she's going to be remembered and defined as a governor in New Mexico. So to see if she does indeed prioritize crime bills is a really interesting choice, especially knowing that the legislature may not be on board fully with some of those issues.
Yeah, and I mean, she really showed up for the last full session when she came down to testify in front of a committee for the first time in years to talk about her Office of Housing, which actually didn't ultimately pass. And she kind of created anyway. They're probably going to look for some more funding too. And we haven't even talked about housing, which is another big button topic.
Right.
Yeah,
that's another. And I think even if they do get going faster at the session, I'm sure it's still going to be a crazy final few weeks. I know I'm looking forward to some of that and dreading some of that at the same time. But moving gears, do you have any tips for people who haven't been to the Roundhouse as much as far as just kind of dealing with the pace and the scheduling, or if anybody wants to come check out some of these in person? Or
yeah, if you want to find parking, get there at 4 a.m. No, the pace is really, really quick. I mean, just check the nmlegis.gov website. Often they're usually updating it. It's bam, bam, bam. And as the session goes on, the pace gets quicker and quicker. And it's a really stimulating environment. There's so much going on everywhere. So pick what you want to prioritize that day and follow along.
Yeah. I would add to that, maybe to bring a snack with you.
Although the cafeteria is open now, right?
Open.
Right.
The cafeteria is good food. Plug to the cafeteria. But, there's been many days when I forgot to bring enough food and the cafeteria closes, and then, it's kind of a rookie mistake, but I've made it even over the years. So bring some snacks, bring water, maybe some hand sanitizer. Usually the crud gets going around at the Roundhouse, so knock on wood. But I think it's going to be a really fascinating session, with a lot of these issues.
Yeah, it'll be crazy.
Yeah.
And in the Roundhouse, if I still have trouble navigating the Roundhouse, but I usually just go in circles until I end up finding where I need to go.
Well, I think even for some of the new legislators may be doing the same thing, and kind of wish they would have name tags this year, but it'll be interesting seeing some of that new energy and what new perspectives and, issues they all bring to the building.
Yeah, it'll be a good one. This has been Rounding Up the Roundhouse. Be sure to tune in soon for our next episode featuring House Speaker Javier Martinez and House Caucus Chair Rebecca Dow.
We look forward to providing you more updates during the legislative session. Also, check out our webpage, abqjournal.com, for stories we'll have there. And be sure to check back for more podcasts. Where can you find them at, Megan?
Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.